So good evening, I'm Sandra Clark. I'm WHYY's Vice President for News and Civic Dialogue, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to tonight's Race at the Crossroads, the first in our series of courageous conversations. We all know that talking about race in this country has never been easy. Fear, anger, distrust, and confusion often go hand in hand with this issue. So what happens? We don't talk about it, or we grouse amongst ourselves, or we wait for it to erupt out of any number of daily happenings, often descending into division and politics instead of right and wrong. Our hope tonight is that we don't have the usual preaching to the choir kind of conversation. We are here to sit together, to learn how to talk about race, and to understand and commit to what we each can do to move the needle. So many of you know that WHYY for its local programming and PBS and NPR offerings, but as your home for public media, WHYY also brings you events like this, designed to engage our community, to broaden our perspective, and strengthen our resolve. Tonight, WHYY is partnering with 3 other organizations that are also committed to community dialogue. WURD, yes? Yeah, okay. Okay, yeah. The American Bible Society, and Philadelphia Media Network, publisher of the Inquirer, Daily News, and Philly.com. WHYY is grateful for their partnership. Our program tonight can be heard live on Word, 900 AM, and seen on live stream at newsworks.org. It also will be covered for radio, print, and web by WHYY and Philadelphia Media Network. And for those of you on Twitter, and we hope you're out there, our hashtag for this evening is #RaceMatters. Before we continue, I want to thank our WHYY members in attendance. Any members, WHYY members? Thank you very much. It is, without you, we could not continue to provide important content and conversation. And if you'd like to join WHYY, you can go to WHYY.org. So as you've probably noticed by now, all of you are seated at tables with people you probably don't know. You will have an opportunity to speak to each other honestly and safely about race in a moderated breakout sessions after our panel. So we have to be uncomfortable sometimes to be courageous, and we have to be courageous to make change. So I thank you very much for coming tonight on behalf of all of our partners. And here to now introduce our panel is the CEO and President of WRD, Sarah Lomax-Reese. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's great to see such a wonderful, full and diverse audience tonight. We have been planning this for several months. I think I saw Bill Marazzo, who's the president and CEO of WHYY, shortly after Trump was elected. And we got into a conversation, and I said, our organizations, because WORD is the only African-American talk radio station in Pennsylvania. So we wrestle with race and social justice all the time. And so I said, WORD and WHYY coming together really would be this wonderful opportunity to bring cross-cultural, cross-racial dialogue to Philadelphia in a very intentional way. So this is wonderful. And over those months, working with Sandy Clark, more partners were engaged in this process, the American Bible Society and the Philadelphia Media Network. And so we have this wonderful 4-way partnership that we're really excited about and are looking forward to this being the first of several conversations. But we're going to see how this one goes tonight, and then we'll decide how we proceed from there. So I have the honor of introducing the panel and our esteemed moderator today. And obviously you guys have this little pamphlet on your table, so I'm not gonna read the entire bio. You can read it yourself. But first let me Let me introduce the panel, starting from the far left, Mary Beth Gassman. And Mary Beth Gassman is on Word regularly, and I'm so happy to see her because I've heard her and for many years, and now we get to see her. Mary Beth Gassman is the Judy and Howard Berkowitz Professor of Education in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Her areas of expertise include the history of American higher education, minority-serving institutions with an emphasis on historically Black colleges and universities, and racism and diversity. So let's welcome Mary Beth Gassman. And next to Mary Beth Gassman is my pick for the panel, was Howard Stevenson, Dr. Howard Stevenson. He is the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education and the Professor of Africana Studies in the Human Development and Quantitative Methods Division of the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the Director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at Penn, designed to promote racial literacy in education, health, and justice institutions. Let's welcome Dr. Howard Stevenson. So I'm also reading these bios because we have a whole listening audience that's listening that's not in this room, and they don't have these. So I want to welcome Erin Haynes-Wack, who is our next panelist. Erin Wack is an award-winning journalist focused on the intersection of race, politics, and culture, including civil and voting rights, and issues of inequality and injustice. She is currently the urban affairs reporter for the Associated Press, based in Philadelphia. Welcome, Erin Haynes-Wack. And last but definitely not least, we have Shane Claiborne. Shane Claiborne is a best-selling author, renowned activist, sought-after speaker, and self-proclaimed recovering sinner, in quotes. Shane writes and speaks about the world, about peacemaking, social justice, and Jesus, and is the author of numerous books, including The Irresistible Revolution, Jesus for President, that would be nice, and Executing Grace. So let's welcome Shane Claiborne. And our moderator for the evening is Dr. Dan Williams. Dr. Williams is the senior pastor of New Life in Christ Fellowship, located in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. He holds a Master of Divinity and a Doctor of Ministry from Biblical Theological Seminary, where he serves as Director of Urban Programs and Assistant Professor of Practical Theology. So let's welcome Dr. Dan Williams. Thank you. All right.
Sarah, thank you, and welcome again to what I think is going to be an incredible conversation tonight. I hope that tonight becomes an opportunity for us to exchange information, to be inspired, and certainly to leave this place more equipped than when we arrived. Someone might rightly ask tonight, why another conversation about race? Haven't we had enough talk? Well, the truth is that action has been slow in coming, and until attitudes change, words are certainly better than war, which makes discourse preferred. To some degree, these discussions about race can be difficult, and tonight we're hoping that we can have this conversation with more light rather than heat, more information rather than emotion. And so tonight we should get started. Our panel has been introduced, and I'd like to begin this way. It's been suggested that somehow the story of race in America is an American story. So tonight, let's begin by allowing each of you to share a little bit of your personal stories, of your first experiences, first encounters with racism. Dr. Gassman, we'll start with you.
All right. Well, it's really wonderful to be here, and thank you to so many people for coming. For me, I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is not in the mitten, but up near Canada. It's a little scraggle between Canada and Wisconsin that a lot of people don't know exists. And I grew up very poor in rural poverty. And I think that issues of race, which I don't even know if I would have known what the word race necessarily meant as a child, but I do remember that I grew up in a home where my father had a lot of hatred toward especially African Americans, but I would say nearly every other racial and ethnic group with the exception of Native Americans. And so I grew up with this vile human being who used every racial slur, who said the most terrible things about various people of color. He also said terrible things about Jews and people who might have been gay, or anybody who wasn't like him. And so I also grew up in a very Catholic home, right? And so I remember going to church, and my dad always had to sit in the second row because we had to be seen, right? We had to get there early and we needed to be seen. And I remember thinking, my dad is this devout Catholic who wants us to be here and to listen to this word, and the word is telling me that I'm supposed to accept people and I'm supposed to be loving and giving, right? And my dad, on the other hand, is this horrific individual on a daily basis. And so I think when I got a little bit older and I started to read in school, and I do want you all to know that my books in school reinforced what my dad told me. Okay, so they were also racist. The school system was also really racist. I mean, my school system had a slave auction when I was in 8th grade. And so, and I'm 49, so just let that, digest that a little bit, okay? So we still have them today. And so, what's interesting is that I think when I got in school and I started to read a little bit beyond and started going to the library and picking out the books that they didn't want me to read, then I started pushing back at my dad, and for almost 22 years, I had a horrific relationship with my father, which we can talk more about, but I would say that was all based on race.
Excellent.
That was all based on my calling him a racist.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Stevenson.
I would say, since we're talking about childhood, I grew up in a multicultural home. Both my parents were black. My father was from southern Delaware. Anybody heard of Delaware? Nobody heard of Delaware. And my mother's from North Philly. And so those two places are as different from each other as East is from West. And as it pertains for our discussion today, they had very different policies on how you handle racial rejection. My father had us in church what seemed like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. His idea was when people treat you badly because of the color of your skin, you pray for them with the idea that God would get them back in the end. He believed that you don't sully yourself with the everyday, it's a spiritual warfare, and let God take care of it. He was a vengeful person. He just thought it was a spiritual vengeance. My mother grew up in North Philly, was used to running out of segregated neighborhoods from people who didn't look like her, and she was used to chasing people out of her neighborhood. So it was equal opportunity chasing and running in segregated ways. She was very different. She would get in your face. She would teach us to get in other people's face. So the one example I remember is when I was in 1st grade in Milton Elementary School. I had to fight white boys on the playground. And some of you know my brother, my little brother, Brian Stevenson. He wrote a great book called Just Mercy. My mother, because she was in your face, I couldn't come home and say that I hadn't battled them. And there was another friend of mine, a migrant young man from a migrant family, Joseph Santiago, who was great when he was around because he was tall to everybody. He helped me fight very well. But he was gone after about 3 months of the year. My mother would take my brother at lunchtime and push him over the wall so he could help me fight during those times. And so part of my story about dealing with racism is sometimes you have to pray, but sometimes you have to fight.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I actually am a Philadelphia transplant, and I come here from my hometown of Atlanta. And to be from Atlanta means that certain things loom very large over your life from a very young age, race definitely being one of them. You learned about Martin Luther King whether you wanted to or not. You worship Martin Luther King for the most part. If you were a black person from Atlanta, you're very proud to be, from Atlanta because of Martin Luther King and for what he was able to do for this country and the world. And so, my mom raised me and my brother by herself. And, she was born and grew up, lived, a good bit of her life in segregation. And, so she had a healthy distrust, frankly, for white people for a long time, but did not at all, instill in us that we should not like white people, that we should not befriend white people. And so, my upbringing was pretty mixed. She made a very deliberate decision when I was little to move us. We were the first black family on our street in my hometown, which is about 20 miles outside of Atlanta. And, she understood that, while, we were not better than anybody and nobody was better than us, being in proximity to white people would afford us certain privileges that we would not otherwise have, especially in terms of our education. And she, instilled in my brother and in me that really, there was nothing that we couldn't do. It was just that we would have to work twice as hard to get it. And so she was very honest with us. I can remember, from being young about kind of the racial realities, kind of that, there was a separate system for us and for white people, and that we would just have to work in spite of that system. And so that was kind of, how I was raised. But also at the same time, like I said, if, you have the legacy of the civil rights movement. And so, while that definitely gave me, a certain lens and awareness, about racism in America, it also did give me a sense of the progress that was possible for this country, and the idea that, black people and white people could work together to make this country a better place. And so, ever since, I decided I wanted to be a journalist, I knew that writing about race and exploring race was going to be the focus of that journalism. And so it is definitely a privilege, to be able to talk to people just like a lot of you in this room, to explore a lot of those issues and figure out how, we as a country move forward.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Shane.
Well, I'm Southern too. I can't hide it. I grew up down in Tennessee, and I was, like all of us, I guess, kind of conditioned by the environment I grew up in. I grew up in the church. I also grew up in a town that was quite segregated, but I didn't really have the eyes to see that. My high school, Maryville High School, was the rebels, and we had the Confederate flag on everything. It was painted on walls, it was on football uniforms, and I didn't know that was weird until I came up to Philly and I was putting my high school yearbook on my college shelf. My friends were like, "Whoa, brother, sit down." And said, "What is that?" I'm like, "That's my high school yearbook." They were like, "It's also not cool," and I got schooled a little bit, and I began to see that, someone told me one time that our worldview is shaped by whatever we've seen out the window. And when our window changes, our worldview begins to shift. And that happened to me. I started to really see that all of us, I think, are conditioned to trust people that are most similar to us, And my friends in college, I went to a great college, Eastern University, where Brother Brian Stevenson went. And some of my friends had a passion for folks that had hard lives. So they started taking me into the city to hang out with folks on the street. And I was so nervous that someone would hear my Southern accent and mug me that I hid my credit cards in my dorm room. And while I was downtown hanging out with folks on the street, one of my colleagues broke into my dorm room, stole all my credit cards, and went shopping. And I thought, the folks I had been conditioned to distrust, it was all ungrounded, and all the folks I had been conditioned to trust, it wasn't that simple. So I've been living on the north side of Philadelphia in Kensington for the last 20 years. I've been leaning in and listening to my neighbors. I think that my worldview is richer because of the diversity of friendships that I've been privileged to have. So I've been listening and learning for 20 years.
Excellent. Appreciate it. Let's move into another area, this idea of leaning in, because to some degree, believing that the black experience is different from the white experience is really going to be the beginning of changing at least white attitudes and perspectives. How do we get there if white people don't believe the real life experiences of black people? Anyone can respond to that.
Well, as someone who's white, the way that I would respond is that I'm constantly telling white people to believe when let's say, when African Americans or other people of color tell you that they're going through something, that they're experiencing something, that something is prejudiced or racist, hurtful, right? I'm constantly telling people, just believe them. And what I think is really interesting is this idea that we wouldn't believe people. Because as whites, if something happens to us, we want people to believe that it happened. And if they don't believe us, we would be really, really angry. But most of the time when you're white, people do believe you. They believe you. They take your story for granted that it's true. They don't question it. And so, one of the things I guess that I say quite often to people is, why don't you believe people? What is it that makes you not believe? Is it that you're faced with the reality that these things are actually happening and perhaps you're not doing anything about it? And lately, in recent months, I've been spending a lot of time talking to white people about how dangerous their silence is when it comes to all these racial issues. I mean, we white people have got to speak up. We can't sit here and pretend that these things are not happening. I mean, so many of our ancestors have done that. And we've got to stop. We have to stop. So for me, as someone who's white, I feel like it's an obligation for me to be constantly challenging other whites and saying, why don't you believe? What is it about it that you don't believe, and why, and where does that all come from?
Excellent. Who else wants to weigh in?
I would say, really, it starts with being open to the idea that, well, being open to other people's experiences that are not necessarily similar to yours, right? I mean, you are not, yes, you may be a white person who has never had a negative exchange with a police officer. You regard police officers as helpful and friendly and somebody who is there to protect you and who's going to be responsive to you. And so the idea that that would not be true for somebody just because they are not white, it may be something that's completely alien to you. The idea that your child would not be treated the same in a classroom because you expect the teacher in that classroom to treat your child a certain way, for your child to, get a certain, level of education. So for the idea that teachers might treat somebody differently, no way. I couldn't imagine that happening because it would not happen to you. Not really productive. And it doesn't allow, having that view doesn't allow you to believe, to really believe anybody else if that's going to happen. The idea that, well, of course it's not that hard to register to vote. I don't understand why people don't register to vote. I mean, what are the obstacles really? What do you mean somebody doesn't have a birth certificate? Why wouldn't they have one? What does that mean? It's like, well, actually, some people were born in the South and, maybe they couldn't get to a hospital and maybe they were delivered at home and maybe they don't have a birth certificate. And so maybe that would, present some barriers to them, trying to, prove that they are able, to vote somewhere. Why can't somebody just, I don't understand why people can't just come over here and become legal. Why do they have to come over here and take jobs or, work, certain jobs in on these farms in America? Well, just because it's not your experience doesn't mean that it's not a valid or true experience. And, covering disparities in policing for the past few years, as I have, one of the most powerful things about that reporting has been the proof that was required for Black people to be believed, that this was an actual thing that should be at least addressed, if not confronted, in some way. The idea that there was an issue with Black people and their local police departments and it was not as if people in those communities had not been saying that for a long time. They had certainly been saying it in St. Louis and in Baltimore and in Cleveland and in other places. But, until, they really had not just the weight of us as national reporters coming to those communities, asking questions and writing those stories, but until you had the Department of Justice, going to those communities, documenting this and saying, actually this is true. They were collecting the same stories, that these people had been telling, in various environments. It was just that without the weight of that authority, those people's experiences were not being validated.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, For me, it feels like it's a beginning as a psychological strategy, a way to keep power. That is, if I can get an advantage over you in this moment, is to first disbelieve what you are, what you say, what you believe. And in a sense, I think it's a form of dehumanization. And I think there's a proverb that we use in our work called the lion story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. Means that we hope in a world that people won't discount other people or their stories. But unfortunately, if we do run into that, we have to have the skills to be able to speak up in the face of that dehumanization. So I would say, what is it that whomever, white people or otherwise, who are afraid to hear and believe someone's story, what is it about you that says you're going to be diminished if you actually accept another human being's statement or story about themselves? And therein lies both the problem, but also a chance for solution.
Okay, all right, all right.
And also not to say, I reject this because it is not true for me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, consider this. In the era of Mr. Trump, with the rise in overt racial hostility, how do we, as a multicultural community, have these honest, respectful conversations about race that will lead to a greater understanding? Specifically, I'm thinking that we've talked about the idea of listening as a priority and believability. Anything you might want to add to that to sort of unpack that a little bit further, particularly in this recent era?
Well, I mean, I don't know how recent it is. I think we saw overt racism in the previous administration as well. You know, but what I think, regardless of who is president, I think that it is very important, you know, to remember that we are all each other's fellow citizens. Like, if we can just start there, if you can look at, you know, your neighbors and your classmates and your coworkers as, you know, your fellow Americans, like that is a very helpful starting point to, you know, begin to have those conversations, you know, focusing on at least that foundational thing that makes you alike, if nothing else about you is alike. Starting there is very helpful regardless of who's in office.
All right.
Does Shane have
Shane, were you going to respond to that? I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, sure. Well, I agree with my sister, and I think that, I mean, it's important that, you know, this has come as what Van Jones has called a white lash, you know, after a first black president, after one of the most powerful movements of racial justice and awakening with the movement for Black Lives, and there's a reaction, I think, of white folks right now, and one of the things I think that we've got to do is create spaces like this one where people can listen to each other. And I think for white folks, we got to be in a place where we're a minority more often. I mean, it won't be long before we don't have a choice. Might as well practice a little bit, you know. But I think like we're used to being the dominant, you know, space, and so I think we've got to deliberately seek to learn from black leadership and you know, other folks of color in leadership, and to listen well right now. And I'm deeply troubled as a Christian. You know, it's you know, the statistics all over the news, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And that breaks my heart, because the same people that gave me Jesus gave us Donald Trump. And I look at Trump and I think, like, when I look at the things that Jesus taught, the Beatitudes, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, they are the antithesis of the things that we've come to adore and stand for and celebrate in America. And I think that there's something deep underneath the phenomena of Trump that reveals, I think it's a revealing of America, you know, that our idols have become wealth and fame and power and whiteness. And so we've got to name those. And we can't have truth and reconciliation until we have truth. So I think we really got to speak some truth in this moment.
All right, all right, all right. That's fine. Yes. Dr. Gassman, this question is for you, and all of you may feel free to respond as well. If the path forward is a constant renewal of the nation's ideal of equality for all of our citizens, how do we get to something like equality for all if, in fact, it's never been a part of the American experience?
We're going to let you have it.
Gonna earn my PhD now. All right. Well, okay. So a couple of things that I would say about that. So I mean, I think about that constantly, and I think one of the things that needs to happen, and this sort of piggybacks on something that Shane said, and thank you for what you said, is that I think right now, okay, and I want to acknowledge that Aaron reminded us that none of this is new, and Shane reminded us that this is an unveiling of who we are, right? That one of the things I think we have to do is we have to be really adamant about stating that none of what is going on right now in our country is right. It's not right. It's not right for people to be mistreated. It's not right what's going to happen tomorrow when the budget is released. It's not right. It's not right. It's very easy for those of us who can afford to do all the things that we want to ignore what happens to those who can't. For me, you know, I'm in a situation now. I mean, if you're we both hold endowed chairs at Penn. You're doing okay, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're doing okay. So, but I mean, and I don't know your whole past, but I know my past of coming from really dire poverty. And one of the things I know is I'm never going to forget that. And the other thing I know is the only reason why I'm in this position right now is because of food stamps, of Head Start, of work-study programs, of student loan programs, right? I can keep going and going, of WIC, all of the programs that help people in our society who don't necessarily have a leg up, like my family, helped me to be able to be a professor at Penn. And it's the only reason, aside from one other, mentors, right? Mentors. And in my case, mainly people of color. So when I think about that, I just think that we all have to be aware that in order for our society to all come up, we have to all put in. We have to all be willing to give. And you know, I always laugh every year when people complain about paying taxes because and if it weren't for people paying their taxes, there's no way I could even be in my job right now. You know, I think about that, and I think that we all have, I know this sounds just beautiful and lovely, but we need to take care of each other. And it's one of the things that I really, really cherished about Barack Obama is that he constantly reminded us that we need to take care of one another. And you know, there's a beautiful book by Lisa Delpit, who won one of the MacArthur Genius Awards, and it's called Other People's Children. And I am constantly reminded of that. We need to care about other people's children. We need to care about other people's parents. It's you know, it's great when you make it, but when you don't look back and care about people who have not, I just don't think we're good people. And in fact, we're just perpetuating the racist and classist systems that continue to keep so many people down. So I think we all need to step it up. We all need to sacrifice a bit. We all need to give a bit. And that's how you can get, and I would use the word equity and not equality, but that's how you get equity. You gotta, you know, you gotta give. And sometimes you gotta give something up.
Thank you. Dr. Stevenson.
Yeah, I think just to support what my colleagues have said, they're listening around race, and I think conversations are important, but I worry that what makes it hard to actually have a conversation we still are not equipped to do, and that is fear, the fear of difference, the fear of brown and black people. I mean, if you look at some of the research, if I ask some of you, which grade do you think children are most likely to be expelled? How many of you would say middle school? How many of you would say high school? How many of you would say lower school? Or how many of you would say preschool? The answer is preschool. And there's racial disproportionality that black boys are more likely to be expelled, 2.5 times that of any other group. And the reasons are not about the children, it's about the adults. If you look at Walter Gilliam's work, we can find this kind of racial disproportionality from preschool through college and beyond. So the question that's raised is, what is it that's explaining these outcomes? And fear is a big explanation. What is it about me seeing other people's children, not as children, not as my children, not as human, as something that might hurt me, as something that might scare me? So part of the idea of listening is, do I take notice of what happens to me when I'm in the presence of somebody different? Do I get scared, right? It's one thing to believe in social justice, but the question is, if I only have a minute to make a decision and I see a brown or black child in front of me, do I do just things? Do I do social justice on behalf of that child? And the only way I know about how to do that when we're talking to educators and police is to say, I don't believe, I want you to see my child like you see your child. Because then I know you won't shoot your child. I know you won't expel your child the first time they piss you off. I know you won't see your child like a snake or a monster, which if you look at the research, what that racial threat moment fear is about. As much as I would like to listen, as much as I'd like to be good and moral, my fear takes over that moment. And in that situation, either me or you, and I'm going to go home. And I think that's how we've got to be courageous to say, what do I notice about myself when I'm in that fearful moment? Can I take stock so that my decision making isn't do or die?
Yeah.
It's about you are just like me. You remind me of my child. You remind me of my people. Then I think we can have a conversation that makes sense.
Aaron, you look like you wanted to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would add to that, like I said, I mean, living in Atlanta, I had, a civil rights legacy that kind of hung over me. But since then, my career has taken me to our nation's capital. I lived in Washington, D.C. That, the place where, our government, our government is and where, the laws are made that control our lives. And now I live in Philadelphia, the cradle of democracy. And so, really, I think, too, since I've been covering politics here for the better part of a decade, and I feel like especially, in the past several years, people are really starting to think about what it means to be a citizen again. And, I think that, there is nobody, whether they are an American citizen or whether they are in America, who does not read our Declaration of Independence and who does not read our Constitution and who does not think about what that means for them being here. Because, I mean, they're very powerful documents. What we are talking about, what we are grappling with is how we are going to perfect this union. And, I think, your question about, what do you do, to get there, or how do we feel like we're going to get there when that's not where we have ever been? I don't know if that's the right question because, I think about my ancestors and their ancestors, and at no point in this country, have black people been here not trying to be more free, with every generation. You had people who lived and died in slavery, but that does not mean that they did not resist. That does not mean that they did not struggle against that institution to try to gain freedom, if not for themselves, for their children, for their grandchildren. Slavery ends, you have, Jim Crow segregation. At no point were those people not trying to get out from under that system. Maybe they weren't going to be the ones that were able to vote, but their child was going to be able to vote, and that was going to be something that happened. And so, as a Southerner, I'm just going to use the football analogy. I mean, every generation, regardless of whether it was going to mean anything for them or not, they may not get the touchdown, but they were going to move the chains every single time. And so that's what you do while you are here. Whether you get the touchdown or not, you're going to get whoever comes after you that much closer to getting the touchdown.
All right. Another question. Let's keep this moving because you alluded to it a little bit earlier. History and symbolism, in many ways, have created a contentious debate in our culture, and I'm specifically thinking about the New Orleans-related removal of the Confederate monuments. How, in fact, does our understanding of history, or the lack thereof, impact our understanding of race in America? Shane, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll move on down to you, Dr. Gassman.
Well, I growing up down south, I think one of the things that we realize is that we've had a certain version of history that we've been told. When I was with the Equal Justice Initiative down in Montgomery, they put a display up of all of the memorials to the Confederacy, and then they said, now where are the memorials to slavery and to the movement for racial justice, and there were like one or two of them, and one of them was Rosa Parks, and on the back of it, it had Hank Williams on the back. You know, compromises. You know, Martin Luther King Day shares Robert E. Lee Day. You know, like the so. I think you know, Brother Brian is right when he said that we won the movement for civil rights, but we still haven't won the narrative, and the narrative is still that people of color are lesser, you know, and I think until we have the truth about history, we're going to continue to live in the residue of that racism. Like you go to places that have had major injustice, but there's memorials everywhere to the Holocaust, to the apartheid, you know, and we want people to remember history and the wounds of it, because we can't heal those wounds until we recognize them. So I think that's why putting up memorials to lynching and to slavery and to remind us of the horror that we're capable of, that's the only way that we can move forward, is by recognizing where we came from.
Excellent. Dr. Gassman, you respond as well. I know you wanted to say something about that.
Well, as a historian, which is the way that I'm trained, I would say that there are a couple things. One, I think that we do an incredible disservice to all of our children across the country by not making history come alive for them. That's one thing. I feel really, really privileged to live in Philadelphia, and that my daughter went to Philadelphia public schools K through 12 and had mandatory African American history. Right? I mean, very few kids get that. And so my daughter, who's 18, knows more about African American history than most adults that I know at this point. I mean, I help a little, right? But the other thing that I would say is that, and you know, Shane, I'm really glad that you brought up, for example, the Apartheid Museum. So for years and years, I think I've taken almost probably something like 700 people to South Africa over the past 12 years, and students. And one of the things that I think is really, really important when we go there is for them to visit the Apartheid Museum. And you know what's really interesting is each time we visit, the students that I take of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds, what I love is that there's a special exhibit in the Apartheid Museum called American Apartheid. And the first thing, and the students get really mad. A lot of them get really mad because they're like, why is that in there? You know, why is it in there? Because it's very easy to go to another country and tell them how terrible they are. But what they find out is that all the same things happened here. And in fact, we invented some of them, right? So, but what I want to say about that is, you know, all these monuments that are coming down, right? So, and I was saying this to Howard, I would like, if we're going to take those monuments down, which I think is fine, I would like us to put them in a museum that helps people to understand what American racism is. I'd like all of those things in there, with you know, curated in a way that helps us to understand what has happened, who was oppressed, right? Who was oppressed, and how this all happened. Because I don't want to see us repeat things. And what I see right now is a slow wiping away of our past, and people trying to get us to believe that these things didn't happen. History books saying that slaves were happy or that they were well taken care of. Presidents of the United States saying that. You know, people who are in charge of HUD saying that. Our Secretary of Education making comments like that. What's happening, it's in quote, a whitewashing of American history, and it is hurting all of us. And you know, I think one of the things that I really, really respect about Jewish Americans is that they always say, never forget, right? Never forget, never forget. Well, we can't forget, and that's the only thing I'm worried about with all of these things coming down. Let's put them somewhere and make sure that everyone knows that we had this past. And wouldn't it be wonderful if it was a past? It's not, right? But wouldn't it be wonderful if it was a past and we could look back and say, oh, we were there, but look where we've come. And so I think that's, you can't forget your history. You just can't.
Absolutely. What we have to do at this moment is we have to take a break to shift gears for a minute. Those of you standing in the back, you're going to be able to form your own small groups. For those of you who are listening in, we want you to continue to listen. And you're going to have table facilitators to move throughout other elements of the conversations we'd like you to have among yourselves. And so give us an opportunity to switch gears. you'll be moving towards the table facilitators and that conversation, and we're going to continue our conversation right here on stage. Thank you. One of the things that we're going to do now is just have our own conversation here on the stage for those who are continuing to listen, all right?
All right. You need a chair, man?
I think that'll help.
Sit down with us, yeah.
So I get to sit down,
It's hard standing up, man.
and we get to continue.
Is this
this,
live on the...
So right now, we still have people who are listening.
Okay.
They're a part of this conversation. And while the larger audience won't be able to hear you, everyone who's live streaming and listening will.
Okay.
And so far, I want to say that I think this has been a great dialogue. Let me try to keep it moving by asking you, you looked as if you wanted to add something to the idea of the historical symbolisms coming down, and I don't want to cut you off. So Aaron, how did you want to respond to that?
Well, you know, what I was going to say, I think, the key phrase in your question was, the lack thereof. Mary Beth talked about never forgetting. In some cases, you've got people that never learned this history in the first place. So, they can't, it's not even there for them to forget. You've got, I was astonished when, frankly, the president did ask, we need to talk about, what the cause of the Civil War was. And it's like, wait, of course, I am, slavery is, what I would scream is the answer. But there are people who still in 2017 would be open to debating whether or not slavery was the cause of the Civil War. And so if that's where we are as a country in 2017, then you know that we have a long way to go, especially in terms of educating people about and getting people to be honest about the history of this country. When you can have a Secretary of Education who, refers to historically black colleges as, pioneers in school choice, that would be astonishing to me as somebody who knows better than that and who, but I also must recognize that not everybody actually knows that. And why don't they know that? And, what do we need to do so that more people do know, that is in fact not true? Here we are in the midst of, the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction. That is not a conversation that we are having, and yet that legacy is still with us. Why are we not having that conversation? That context is relevant, to where we are. And so when you don't have that context, what ends up happening is that you treat incidences of race or racism as individual things that need to be addressed and then moved on from, instead of part of a pattern and practice that it uncovers systemic things that need to be changed and addressed.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Stevenson. I can see you nodding approvingly. So
everyone, when Mary Beth was talking about the importance of not whitewashing, I think that's important. When Shane was talking about, and just now, Aaron, the idea of learning. When Brian was doing, when there was this discussion from South Carolina about Confederate flag and the like and the removal, part of the struggle is he felt a long time he couldn't convince anybody why they need to be removed because of the argument that it's a cultural history. So part of the fight part on his side around bringing up lynching and the history of lynching and to actually commemorate lynching with the museum he's now going to be building in the next year is to say that if you're going to have that flag, then you should also have the history of this lynching that goes along with it. So you can't whitewash what the history of that flag is as well. So if you keep it up, but also know that in these particular places are the same. This flag represents this kind of killing and murder because of people, and that knowledge. It's another way of teaching a history that's also invisible. And I would just add to that. We are talking a lot about black and white, but we've been, in our sort of work, been trying to identify for Native Americans who are more likely to be shot by police than any other group. That's another form of dehumanization and another form of history that isn't told, that people don't know about, and that the actual invisibilizing or the not knowing is a very important psychological reality, but it's a statement of our history that's living among us right now.
yeah, excellent. Dr. Yasmin.
one of the things I was going to say is that I think it's so important that we do anything that we can as parents, as teachers, in our roles as professors, as community members, to ensure that children are taught a wide history. What ends up happening is that you really end up getting taught a white American history with some sprinkled on others, right? So it's very white, whites are at the center. And the issue is that in this country, whites are not necessarily at the center. There, you know, if you take a look, if we talk about the origins of the country with Native Americans, if we talk about the role of Latinos, right? If we talk about the role of African Americans, the role of Asians in the building of our country, which we often forget as well. You know, why aren't we learning all of these things? And if you start to learn about all of the achievements of all of these different racial and ethnic groups, you start to view people differently. Because what ends up happening is we learn all about the achievements of whites. And so we view whites through that lens. But if we start to teach kids, and I wish there were more ways that we could teach adults. I wish people were more interested in that. But if we start to kind of change that narrative, and we can do it as parents, right? As students can demand that. Not only college students, but high school students, even elementary students can demand that they get an education that is actually representative of the country and not just centering whites as kind of the dominant force.
And I just want to add to what Mary Beth said just then, because I think she made a very, very important point. Not only do we learn about, white American history, through the lens of their achievements. We learn about brown people in terms of their suffering, in terms of their persecution, in terms of their being less than. And we do not learn about the bad things that white people did, in this country. Like we either brush over that or we don't address it at all. And then we don't mention the achievements of brown people, in this country and to this country, and the role that they played in creating the America that we, all, know and love today.
That's a great observation. Let me offer this. Let me toss this out because I think we're headed that way because we haven't talked much about structural racism. Before I do, but let me raise this as an issue. There are people who contend that racism is integral, that it is a permanent and indestructible component of our society. Now, what I'd like to know is, do you believe that that is true? And if you do, how then do you present the truth and avoid creating a kind of crippling despair? There are people who believe that this issue, this conversation we're having tonight, is integral, it's indestructible, that it's permanent. And if that's true, I'm not assuming you believe that to be, but if it's true, let me know what you believe and whether or not you can continue to proclaim what we know to be true in light of what might be creating a kind of despair, and why keep trying.
Well, I don't believe it to be true, but I think that the idea that the fact that there are people that do feel that way goes to the point that structural racism is real. Because if racism was real for you, your parents, your grandparents, and their parents, and you believe that it's going to be true for your children and your grandchildren, then part of the reason that you may believe that may be the structures that are in place that keep you and your family in the same situation over and over and over for generation after generation. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of what my job is as a reporter is I mean, yes, we certainly want to, having those human stories does make, having those experiences being told, getting those narratives out there does, can make racism more real for people, especially for people for whom those are not, their experience. However, having data, having proof, frankly, gets us beyond that emotion and that, what people may have intended, and gets us to the impact. It shows you, how this structural racism exists, by who is being affected. And so if you don't start from, well, somebody didn't mean to do this when they created this law or this agency or these neighborhoods or whatever, if you can get to, well, they may not have meant to do it, but that this is where we are. And so are you okay with leaving this here? Or don't you think that since we know how people are being impacted, shouldn't we try to figure out what to do about that going forward?
A couple of you leaned in, and I don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, do you have something?
Go ahead.
I don't know if you read the book or heard about color law. So the idea of how the government segregated America, it's an interesting thought around housing and its impact. And we just had a launch for our program, Forward Promise, and one of the social advocates, James Bell, made a point to say that gentrification has done more for mass incarceration than this world would ever know. And that part of the idea of systems that are operating and that legally have been allowed to operate to restrict, say, where people live, and how that then determines employment options, determines what kind of schools you can go to, determines how you can pass down wealth to other people in your family. It's quite scary if people knew that. And that over time, how you think about losing options for segments of our folks, poor whites as well. There's a way to consider, how do you teach that to young people about the world too? If you're going to teach history and you're going to teach segregation, do you also need to teach intergenerational segregation? And that your government is complicit in setting up a world that is the way we argue and fight now that was quite structural. And I think that's a lesson for young people, very different and additional to learning about white, black, brown, but also how this is all set up, right? And can we have courageous conversations, I guess your point is, without considering it?
Just to spin one more dynamic into it too, I think we're talking a lot about black and white, and I think there's also the native piece of that too, to where like if we're really going to heal the wounds of history, we've got some serious responsibility to repair those wounds, you know, I think just as there's the narrative side where how we tell the story of Christopher Columbus, you know, is important. And, you know, I didn't learn growing up that he said natives are such good folks, they'll make good slaves, you know, like those were not things I learned about Christopher Columbus, you know. So I think there's also the side that like a lot of folks want to move to a post-racial reality, but the fact is our CEOs are not there and the police are not there, the institutions aren't there. And so I think if we're really going to heal the wounds of that, you'll see it. And one of the least affected institutions in society when it comes to the civil rights movement has been the criminal justice system. And, you know, in my neighborhood, our schools are going bankrupt at the same time that Radnor schools are getting, you know, smart boards and iPads. And so I think those inequities, we got to see those. And race is a major player in all that.
Dr. Gassman, you seem like you have something you want to say.
Oh, well, one thing I was going to say is that regarding whether or not I think that racism is, I guess, endless, right? There are entire groups of scholars who believe that racism has no end, and I do not believe that. And one of the reasons I don't believe that is I do think it's a dire way to live. You know, it's a very dire way to live, and it also renders people helpless and powerless. And so I think that if we believe that, then what do? We just give up. And so for me, you know, getting up every day, every single day that I get up, I'm thinking about racial issues in the country, every single day, right? And I know that most people probably don't live their life that way, but especially most white people, but I do. And part of that is that I'm thinking about, how do I make a difference? How do I make change? How do I find a way to make the lives that are really difficult better? How do I do that? Even if it's a small way, right? Even if it's a small way. Even if it's just listening to someone who is really having a rough time in a class with a professor who's treating her in a really racist way. But I'll listen, you know, I'll listen and I'll believe her. I'll believe what she says to me, right? So I feel like I feel like you can make progress with individuals. I'm very hopeful about that. And what I always remind people is systems are made of individuals. So if we can make progress with individuals, then we can change systems. But it really does take what I said earlier. I mean, we have to be willing to give something up. You know, we have to be, I feel like so many of us hoard all the opportunity and don't give it to enough people, and we don't even need it all. It's sort of when people get so rich that they don't know what to do with their money. I mean, there are so many of us that have so much opportunity, and we could be giving that opportunity to so many others, right? And I think that I think it's doable. I don't think that prejudice goes away, because I think prejudice is everywhere. But education can help alleviate racism. Conversations can help alleviate racism. Interaction, personal stories, listening, all the things that Howard was talking about they're so important. And I guess for my own life, the fact that my dad really turned a corner in the end because of a relationship with an African American man, the first one he ever met, but it changed his whole life. It changed his views about everybody, even my sister who's lesbian. All of a sudden he was okay with her. Right? So the conversation with the African American man changed my dad's views with my sister. And these things don't even really combine, right? But what he realized is a window opened, as Shane said, and what he realized is that, I was wrong. I was wrong. I was wrong, and maybe I'm wrong about something else, and maybe I'm wrong about something else. And so I think that I'm always given hope by my dad. Because as I said, 22 years I fought that man, and nothing I did mattered. You know what mattered? A friendship with a guy named Charlie. That's what mattered. So I guess I tend to be very hopeful about things, because I do think that there are those turning points in our lives that change. For me, it was sitting in a Catholic church, thinking to myself, why is my dad saying all this and then telling me that I should follow Jesus? It doesn't make any sense. One of them is wrong, right? And since this one guy's got all these books written about him, I think it's my dad. So.
Well, you alluded to something earlier about the idea of post-racial America. And I'm not sure, but the late Dr. Francis Cress Welsing talked about the idea that some of the tension emerging, particularly from white supremacist groups, others in America, was located in a kind of genetic destruction, dismantling, that would make white in America no longer dominant. And so I'm curious to know where you land in light of that conversation. You alluded to it earlier in one of your comments about the way the world is changing, the way the world is browning, and that's going to happen no matter what we do, given the roles of interracial marriage, relationships, a kind of cross-pollination that's occurring now. The Census Bureau suggests that by 2045, this browning of America, quote unquote, the end of white majority rule in America will be over. Let me hear you respond to that a little bit.
Well, I just would say, it was on the Oprah show, I think it was Raven Simone said that, she didn't want to be seen as a black woman, she just wanted to be seen as human. And I feel like I can appreciate the humanity of someone, but I also think that there's a danger in the color blindness, the idea that we don't see color, because over and over we know that people see color. Police officers see it. The Freakonomics study that shows the exact same resume just is presented, but the names are different. On one it's Greg, on the other one it's Deshaun, and Greg gets the job over and over and over. So I think we've got to be careful to think that we can just move into a colorblind society. And there's something about, I think, cultural blindness too, that I think that God created culture, and God loves diversity. Every DNA is different, every fingerprint's different. I think that we are unique people, and the world's better when we can see it in color. When we can see each other's culture and appreciate each other's history. So I think we got to be really careful about this idea that we just want to, be blind to that. We've moved on from history, and we got a lot of work to do before we can say we've healed those wounds.
Howard, you're going to say something, I think.
Yeah, I think Francis Cress Welsing's work, I think, is powerful and controversial. And I don't agree with all of it, but the part that I think makes sense, and this comports with the racial threat research, that is, if you look at, and even some of the MacArthur scholars, one out of Stanford whose name I'm forgetting, she's done all this work on what are people thinking when they have moments and they're faced by people of color in their presence. And the images that come up are very primitive images of darkness, of animals, of apes, and that those images are what trigger. Like if you said I only had a couple of seconds to make a decision and a brown person in front of me, the idea is that if that triggers for me a sense of fear that comes from you maybe hurting me or these images, and I'm not even conscious of them. Let's just say the implicit bias research is saying teachers in preschool don't know why they're always, if you ask them, they're saying we're fair with everybody. But you ask most parents, they say, I love all my children. And you go to the children, you ask, no, he loves Johnny more than he loves everybody. So the reality is it's always implicit. You don't really know. But the color confrontation theory suggests that your color is going to annihilate me. There's going to be less of me in this moment. And it's not very far off from what this other research is doing. I said, that's the interventions we've got to make. And I think individuals can change once you reveal to them, did you realize how you unconsciously decided who was better than another, who was scarier than another, who was going to hurt you more than another, who you couldn't give all your best to than another, or who scared you that you were just paralyzed to give anything. That's where I think we can make differences, because we can actually help people to say, calculate, locate, communicate. What's going on with you now? Like when they're talking out here, I'm interested in what's going on with them when they're listening to their partners or they're trying to speak. There's a level of anxiety. What do people think of me? Will I say it the wrong way? And that's what we want to get at, to push the courage to speak up and to say what your voice is. And, or to say, stuff that are hard to hear, but that are part of your story. So I think that's where we can make a difference.
Two things. One of them connects to what Howard just said. So recently, Howard and I were together, and he was mistaken for another African-American man, okay? And I, of course, noticed it immediately when it was happening. And so he said, that happens to me all the time. And I said, well, I'm sure that it does. However, one of the things that I've been doing lately is every time I see white people do that, I pull them aside and I say, hey, come here. And I say, I want you to know that you just mixed up two people that you regularly interact with. And what's wrong with it? And they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do it. I realize you may not have meant to do, but what it means is that you're not seeing them. You're not listening to them. You don't know their stories. You're not looking at them. And you need to go and apologize. And so, one of the things, and I know, they're probably getting mad at me, but one of the things that you said, Howard, was that once people realize it, sometimes they change. And so one of the reasons why I've been doing that lately is because I'm hoping that maybe the next time when they're in a room with people, they listen to their name, they listen to their story, and they look at the differences, right? Because none of us wants to get mixed up. As someone who's called Mary Ann and Mary Lou and Mary everything all the time, I like it when people call me Mary Beth. The second thing I was gonna say, and I know someday this will come back and get me, but is that I'm not interested in a post-racial society. Post-racism society would be lovely, okay? But I, like Shane, I want to appreciate people's race, their culture, their gender, their religion. I want to appreciate all the many facets of who they are. And I would never want to be sitting here and in my mind thinking, I don't see anything. I would never want to, I don't want to live in a colorblind society. I want to live in a society that appreciates all the differences. And Shane, I love what you said. I mean, we should say that more often. Even if you're not religious, right? That God loves diversity, fingerprints and, all of these different DNA, right? None of them the same. I mean, what a powerful thing to say And so we should be appreciating all of these differences that we have instead, and we need to do this within racial groups too, right? And within genders. Because
One of the things we talk about in our community is we talk about harmonizing without homogenizing. You know, and I think that's the beauty of harmony.
Right.
It's like
I love that.
oneness doesn't mean sameness.
Right.
You know, unity doesn't mean uniformity.
Right,
Like we
right.
actually are rich in community
Right.
and with different voices and harmony.
Right, and we have to get more people to understand that and to see the beauty and the differences in all of us. So post-racism, that would be great. We're not anywhere near there, but post-racial, I mean, I think race is an important concept in our daily lives.
Right.
And definitely, you know, to your point, Mary Beth, and Howard, to your point too, you know, the fear, well, a lot of the history of this country is about what white people do when they feel threatened, but whether they are being threatened or not, when they feel threatened by brown people in some way. That is the history of this country, right? So it is one thing to address on a case-by-case basis an instance of injustice, right? I mean, you know, I think that most people know what injustice is, you know, on an individual level. They would say, oh, that is wrong, we should right that wrong, and then we can move on, right? But when you are talking about equity, giving people an equal playing field, you know, that means, whoa, well, if this person is going to have what I have, then that means that I maybe have to lose something for that person to get something. I'm not comfortable with that. And that also has been the history of this country.
So that's a great segue, because what you're describing, Howard, I've heard you talk about the element of fear. To some degree, the application of racism, racist attitudes needs power in order to be applied. And so you're talking about a sharing of resources.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw in this past election, we've seen polling that showed cultural anxiety was a driving factor in a lot of people's decision last November. And you ask most of those people, they would say, no, I am not racist, but I felt my way of life was being threatened, and I made a choice based on the preservation of that, and not thinking about my fellow citizen, my neighbor, my postman, whoever in my community, that may be different from me, who I feel may be encroaching on my way of life, or who may be a part of the changing America that I see, that means I'm kind of losing, the America that I knew or that made me comfortable.
Howard, you look like you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a lot of things as Aaron was talking about, the invisibilizing, that the fact that we don't hear anybody's story is part of the problem, right? And I think when you started out and saying that people are dismissing other people's stories, I still think of it as the beginning of a dehumanization. It says, I'm better than you. I have the right to think that your humanity in this moment doesn't count. I remember a story where we grew up, and also very poor, but we lived in a neighborhood where my mother would say, you don't come home if somebody calls you a name. You don't come home without having told me you responded to that. And we had neighbors who were down the road a piece, who were a white family. And we used to fight with them all the time. And I remember that hostility that we had to protect ourselves. One day, the mother of that family, and she had maybe 8 kids. She came over and asked my mother for a cup of sugar because she couldn't feed her family. And that shifted our sort of view about them as enemies, because she broke down her own stand. Because she had taught her children very similarly, don't you come home, you fight too. But when she had to break down and ask my mother for something to help feed that family, it shifted, it created a new story for us. And the narrative meant we couldn't think of them the same way. We couldn't look at them the same way. So the idea that you would keep somebody else's story from being believed or told is a violence. It's a form of violence. And I just think that we have a lot of places to go. And even when we look at the health issues of poor whites in this country, which is a story that hasn't been told, the fact that we don't know that Native Americans have been killed more than black folks by police, those are stories that are part of a violence that some people should be angry about, even if we might argue taking it out against people who are different from you is not the strategy to help you get to, for people to hear that story.
And I think that a thing that may actually, that has come out of kind of this divisive and acrimonious political climate is that you have white folks who are not being believed by other white folks. Mm-hmm. And you've got a climate where, people are, choosing their own facts, and rejecting facts that they don't like, and you've got white people that are alarmed by this and are feeling aggrieved by this. And so are beginning to kind of conceive of, for the first time, what it feels like to not be believed by a white person. And that is very upsetting for them, and it is causing them to explore some things that maybe they wouldn't have explored before last year.
Good. Very good. Let me raise this. The metaphor for our conversation tonight has been race at the crossroads. And there obviously are places and monuments, as well as moments in history where our nation's destiny seems to have been determined. Mm-hmm. John Lewis describes the Edmund Pettus Bridge as such a place. He identifies that bridge as a kind of deciding factor for the direction of our country. And tonight we're using the metaphor crossroads. He would use a bridge. What would you be thinking about as a metaphor to get us from where we are to where we need to be as a nation in regards to the issues of race? If crossroads is the context for our conversation tonight, where we stand, if, according to Lewis, a bridge became another jumping off point, what might be an additional metaphor that you might use? Some might look at Ferguson as a pivotal place, moment in time. What might you consider to be a deciding place?
Well, I mean, one thing I would say is that if I were, I think there are all these different moments, but if you were, from my perspective, if you look at the country as a whole, the whole country, so everybody in it, I think that the election of Donald Trump is one of those moments. And part of that is because and I'm going to go back to what you just said, Aaron, because one of the things is that you had all these people who really didn't believe this kind of vile racism was around. They didn't believe they didn't believe the individual racism. They didn't believe the stories of blacks and Latinos and Native Americans, et cetera. They didn't believe those stories, right? But you got onto something here, right? Is that now they're not being believed, and their rights are being stepped on, and the programs that are helping them and their parents are being pulled out from underneath their feet. It didn't matter when it was black and brown people, but when it's white people, they'll start moving. And one of the things that you said, Howard, was, wait. No, you might have said it, Aaron. Trying to remember about your. Oh yeah, you did. About where you lived, right? And your mom knew that if you go where white people are, right, you're going to get more resources. And which is one of the reasons why I've sent my daughter to public school, because I know if more white people send their kids to public school, then more resources will go to public schools. So, but what we know is if it has an impact on white people, people start to take it seriously. And I know there are lots of white people who don't believe that and think that's crazy. It's not crazy. And so I think with the election of Trump, what happened is all the people who were not aware that all this stuff has been going on are fully aware and can't deny it anymore. And it's having an impact on them. And so when are we moved to movement? When it has an impact on us. I wish that we weren't all like that. I wish, and I know that we aren't all, but I wish there were more of us that were moved to action by when we see what happens to others. But most of the time we're moved to action when it has to do with us. And I think the election of Trump it's a big deal.
Yes.
I think, I'm jealous of Mary Beth, because if I wasn't a journalist, I'd be a historian, because I love history, and I love the history of this country because I think it's very instructive. But, I mentioned earlier that we're, at the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction, right? And I think that Reconstruction was a very important moment in the history of this country. And while we didn't necessarily get that right, I think that we had the right instinct when we attempted Reconstruction. When we were trying to heal the country, trying to move forward as a country, not necessarily by subjugating, a certain region of the country, but really by trying to bring this country together and move forward. And to try to get past the stain of slavery as something that was not tenable. And we could be revisiting Reconstruction today and that anniversary, and really thinking about what we need to do in terms of maybe a Reconstruction now, for America, because I do think that, obviously we're not at a parallel crossroads, but we are at a crossroads in a lot of ways around race in America, and the idea of Reconstruction certainly, I think is a metaphor that we could use to try to figure our way out of that.
Powerful.
I was thinking, one of the things when it comes to fear, we were asking some of the kids in the neighborhood after Trump was elected, what are you thinking? And what they said was just heartbreaking. Some of the kids said, is he going to make us slaves again? Another kid said, is my friend Muhammad going to be allowed to still live here? So many things. But then what occurred to me is what also has risen is a fearlessness. I think of Bree Newsom, I think of Kaepernick, and all the different folks that have made such courageous stand. The people that you would think have every reason to fear are fearless, and the other folks that you would think what do they have to fear? They're very scared. A lot of white folks, and so I think it's an amazing moment, to celebrate and stand behind these iconic moments where folks have said, we will not, buckle down with fear right now, and it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It's funny that you bring up Kaepernick. I was talking to somebody today that he can't get a job back in the NFL, right? That I think as you tell the story, you tell all of the story, and that's part of ongoing socialization, like you do with your daughter, I try to do with my sons, that you feel both pressured by, but almost like, let me just tell you all the story, right? Beach and sun. Sand is a sort of metaphor for me. You can either see it as a beach or a desert. And I think if you come to the desert with a bathing suit, you're not prepared for it. But if you understand that it's not going to always have water, you prepare for that. You can still get through a desert. And that's where I think knowledge and history makes some sense, that if you're telling the truth about, we're really not at a beach. You can still prepare for hard times. And speaking truth to power, but you can't imagine you're someplace that you're really not.
Good evening. All right. I know there's a lot of really good conversation going on, but we're going to invite you to just kind of tune back in up here up front. Finish that last brilliant thought, because I heard a lot of brilliance going on around here. Give you about another 10 seconds. I won't count you down. My mother was a third grade teacher, and they used to do the lights. Anybody remember that when we did the lights? Well, hello, my name is Arthur Satterwhite. I'm a senior manager at American Bible Society. Again, we're just excited to be a part of this conversation, to be partnered with WHYY, with Word, with the Philadelphia Media Network, because it's conversations like these that have an impact. It's conversations like these that actually result in change. Something that kind of stuck with me from that first panel, Aaron, you had used the football metaphor to talk about moving the chains, right? Does anybody in here feel like we've moved the chains at least a little bit? Can we get a clap? All right, so what we wanted to do, because we know you're eager to feedback, to talk, to enter into the conversation up here, but you've just exited conversations around your table, right? So we'd invite maybe one or two, just a few tables to maybe share with the entire group, what did you hear? What were you talking about around your table? And there's some mics going around the room. If you want to be one to just share, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. And we just ask you to be brief. We got one right here. I thought I saw a hand. In the back over here, we've got a few hands in the back. Again, we would just ask you to be brief because we want to just kind of sum it up and maybe your top point.
Mr. Stevenson reminded us that we need to look at black children as our children. I think that's one of the most important points that came up at our table.
That's good. That's good.
And I hope I can do everyone justice at this table because, truthfully, it's trying to understand what us white people are not willing to say out loud, are not willing to acknowledge, and understand the hurt, the suffering, and the degradation that we've imposed on black people so we can maintain our position in society.
That's good. Another one. Maybe someone on this left, right here in the middle.
Hi. We had very good conversation here. It was commented how well we were speaking together. And I just commented that we were all grown-ups. And because we're all grown-ups, we can do this. But I want to say, I didn't know that there were white people who actually felt the same way that I feel, in that if they go to a certain neighborhood, they feel uncomfortable. And it's the same thing with me. So that's something we have to work on. But one of the encouraging things that I said that I noticed was that in order to form a more perfect union, we the people, and this is the beginning of being able to form a more perfect union that includes everybody.
That's good. Maybe one more on the left side over here. Somebody.
Evening. So we had a lot of good discussion, but I'll just say we had as far as what discourages us. A lot of people at our table are Christians, and we find it difficult that our churches are really segregated, and even as churches, we're not really reaching out to people. So that was something that was discouraging. But as far as encouraging, we're glad that we had events like this where we're talking. Another thing that was encouraging, or just a solution, would be we understand that we need to have education and educate our children, but we also need to have where we have relations. And when I say relations, but we get to know people, and we not just do it academic, but you also become a friend to somebody, or you actually get to know them and their story and their life.
That's great. Let's just give ourselves a hands. Now, all right, so for this next section of the evening, we want to invite you to talk back, to share, to ask questions of our panelists. And while you're thinking of your questions, that's what I'm going to invite you to do right now. Think of your question. Begin to get a little excited. Get your hands ready. I'm going to open it up as I prepare to kick it back over to Dr. Williams here and just ask the panel. The title of tonight's event was Courageous Conversations, right? Race at the Crossroads. Why do these conversations take courage?
Well, let me say, I think courage, in the way I would define it, is what it takes for you to even get to the place of having that conversation. So I'm interested in what you all were going through before you decided to speak, before you formed in your head. Did you notice anything about yourselves? Did you notice anything about your bodies, what your body was doing? Did you rethink over and over again what you said? Did you say exactly what you wanted to say? And these take about 10 seconds, 30 seconds. And we think in our work that we want police officers and teachers to be able to think, notice themselves in a moment, less than 30 seconds before they make a decision, to decide that you are not scary to me, or that this is my issue, not your issue, that I'm stressed right now, and taking stock of that. We think that's a form of racial literacy. So I'd be interested in, courage to us is not that you save the world, but that you notice yourself, being yourself in these small moments so that you make better decisions for the people who you are here to serve. And that's courageous to admit that I'm scared, courageous to admit that I'm worried about what you think of me. That's courage in the way I would define it.
Well done.
Yeah, I think it sounds like you all were definitely having some very courageous conversations, and taking the step to come here, that's no small thing, because there are a lot of people in this country that are not having these conversations, or they're having them amongst each other, but not with other members of the community, people that would require them to step out of their comfort zone in the way that a lot of you have to come here tonight. So I really, applaud everybody in here for doing that, because it is an important step. And I would encourage you to continue to do it even outside of this room. You've shown here that tonight that it's something that you can do, and it's something that you want to do. And I think that it is. It will take each one of us to begin to be able to do that in our communities, as individuals, to our friends and our neighbors, and people that we know, to begin to, you start with having that kind of base relationship. That trust that allows you to have those conversations. But you guys took a tremendous leap of faith, because you're doing this with strangers. So if you can do it with strangers, you can definitely do it with people that you know, right? With your family members, with your friends. I know it's hard to do it with your family sometimes. I know that that's hard. But I think, but the reason that we don't do this more, the reason that we're not better at it is that we don't do it enough. When it comes to talking about race, practice really does make perfect. And, there are some parts of America where people wake up thinking about race and go to bed thinking about race. And there are other parts of America where people don't think about race at all. And if you have a social media account, you know that this is true. You've seen it play out on your timelines every day, all the time. But if you can make those relationships, you begin to have those conversations, and those conversations are important because they lead to action. This woman in the back talked about, beginning to conceive of seeing a black child as her child. Well, if you can see that, and if you can talk about that, then maybe you begin to act on that in your community, on your social media page. Maybe you begin to talk to somebody else. Well, what can we do to deal with this in our community? And a lot of, the action, that resists racism in this country does begin with conversation. So don't think that just talking about it is not important, or that that's the end of what happens in terms of what you can do.
Thank you. I can tell when someone has, when they want to say something. Shane, I see you.
To say is, I think that it's beautiful to realize that we all bring something to the table, and it takes humility to realize that we can learn from each other. And a buddy of mine says that faith is believing despite the evidence and watching the evidence change. And I think there's people that are believing, by showing up, you're believing the world can be different than it is right now. And after every before every social movement has happened, it's been said, everybody said it was impossible. And after every social movement, everybody says that was inevitable. And I think part of it is that we're showing up. We want to be a part of not just telling history, but making it. And it's a beautiful thing to be a part of conversations like this.
Well done. I know that there is an opportunity now for you to raise questions to our panel. And what we need you to do is simply raise your hand high, and we'll get the appropriate workout, getting the microphone to you. And
Thank you. This is for Mary Beth. When you were talking about your father, you said that he disliked people of color. The only people he was okay with were Native Americans. And I'm really curious about that. Were there Native Americans who he knew, so therefore he had a relationship, so there was no need to see them as other or something?
They were the only people of color that he ever met. We lived right near a reservation. So, that tells you something. One of the things that I mentioned earlier while you were all together is that I was asked if I thought that racism is permanent, and I'm one of these people who doesn't think it is. And the reason why I don't think it is really has to do with my father. And at the end of my father's life, about 5 years before he died, he had a massive stroke, and we had to move him to Tennessee, which, unlike the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, Tennessee has black folks, okay? We had to move him to Tennessee because my little sister was living there, and she was the one who could kind of help with him. Because my mother is very, very small. She's only 4'8" and weighs about 90-some pounds, so she couldn't take care of him. And so, you know, the interesting thing about that is because we were so poor, my dad, we had to put him in a nursing home. And because we were so poor, he didn't get a private room. He got a room with an African-American man. Yeah. And he was really, really angry. He was, in fact, embarrassing and terrible and horrific to that man. Just horrible. And I mean, I was humiliated. My sister was humiliated. My mother, we ended up leaving my dad there with this man. And I don't know what that man did to my father. I have no clue. But when we came back, my dad was a different man. Okay. So I don't know what he did. But I'll tell you something really beautiful about their relationship is that my dad figured out that they both loved John Wayne movies. They both were World War II vets. They both liked to flirt with the nurses inappropriately, okay? They both loved pizza. They both loved breakfast on Sundays, like big breakfast. And they loved swapping stories that were probably all lies. You know what I'm talking about? Okay? And so, you know, my dad ended up with this really, really beautiful friendship for the last 5 years of his life. And I learned a lot about racism from my dad because I asked him one day, you know, Dad, why did you hate African Americans so much? And he told me, he said, because I hated my own life. I never accomplished what I needed to accomplish, what I wanted to accomplish. I lived in poverty my whole life, and I needed someone to blame. And since everyone else is blaming African Americans for the problems in our country, I chose them. And then he told me he was wrong. So.
Another question. I see a hand there.
I thank God for these courageous conversations, and I just pray they lead to congruent actions as well. But I think my real question is, do we see that racism is a team sport, that is systemic? That you have a justice system, you have an economic system, an education system. You have all these systems in place, which means racism is not ignorant. It means that racism is purposeful. And if we begin to understand that, how should we attack those systems? Because talking and us sharing our testimonies are wonderful. It gives us some level of empathy and understanding. But at the end of the day, what is the real focus on trying to change the systems that maintain racism, which keeps us apart?
You didn't address anyone specifically. Did you want a specific person? Who wants to have at that?
All right. I've often thought that if you go to bed at night expecting to eradicate racial discrimination, systemic racial discrimination, you're probably depressed most nights when you go to sleep. That's not a reason to do something about it. Some of you know my brother. You know the work he's done. The work that he and EJI did to no longer, at the Supreme Court level, to fight the idea that 12 and 13-year-olds could no longer be jailed in this country for capital and non-capital crimes was an example of addressing systemic discrimination. The reality is that states are trying to get back the rights to do that again. And that should be a lesson. But curing legal discrimination does not address the trauma that's happening to our children every day. So you can't just fight at the level of systems. You also have to start at home and teach your children about a world that has the systems that doesn't see you as human. And I think that's just as powerful. And it's working your way up as opposed to working top down. But I think it's absolutely essential that we teach young people that the psychology of being in those systems affects how you believe in yourself so that you can't even get through the school that doesn't have you at its best interest, right? I would just say that it's going to take people in power to give up power. The one example in my brother's life and ours is in high school, as a white theater arts teacher, her name was Harriet Jeglin. She was considered the best teacher. She taught us in many respects. In Delaware, there were only like two kinds of plays. You could either be in Hello Dolly or Oklahoma. There was only two plays. In my senior year, she decided to give up power as a white woman by choosing Raising the Sun as the senior school play. There are only 2 white parts in that play, and as you know, Lorraine Hansberry's play, it's a wonderful story about black challenge and progress. I played the role of Willie Bobo, and who lost the money. My brother played the role of Walter, as you know. But the thing about it was she took the heat of the hostility of others in that school, because there was no play for them. There was no place for them. So the compromise was to have 2 plays that year, Raising the Sun and Hello, Dolly. But she made a systemic decision to give up the power, because she took the heat of the white parents in that school and the white students in that school, so that we could be in the center of the pedagogy. We didn't have to be on the outside. We didn't have to catch that heat. So I would argue that systemic has to be defined in many different ways, but you cannot forget the trauma impact of being in those systems on young people, face to face. How do we teach them that they're at a desert, not a beach? It's a lot of sand, but we can prepare you for the desert. You just can't bring a bathing suit. Does that make sense? Okay.
Shane.
My mentors, Dr. John Perkins, he's the son of a sharecropper. He's an incredible civil rights leader. He said, we've all heard it said, you give someone a fish, they'll eat for a day, you teach them to fish, they'll eat for the rest of their life. But he said, we also got to ask, who owns the pond? And why does a fishing license cost so stinking much? And why is it so hard to get to the pond? Like, all of those are a part of the question, too. And I think that's why Dr. King said we're all called to be the good Samaritan and lift our neighbor out of the ditch. But after you lift so many people out of the ditch, you start to say maybe we need to rethink the whole road to Jericho. You know, so I think we've got to look at the justice side of this, you know, and the fact that we've got a crisis on our hands. Like, right now, 1 in 3 African American boys, 1 in 3 born today can expect to go to prison unless we change something, right? This is the residue of slavery. We got more black folks in prison than there were slaves in 1850, right? We've got 5% of the world's population, but we got 25% of the world's prison population, 1 in 4. Like, this is a crisis on our hands, you know. So I think we've got to recognize that, and we got to get in the streets. We got to take courage. You know, some of my friends, I get home from an event like this, and they go, "How was it?" And I go, "Ask me in a year." You know, because this is not about a moment, it's about a movement. And I think we gotta keep waking people up to the crisis that we're in right now. And those of us that have been privileged, so-called privileged, we gotta realize that one of my friends said, privilege is being born on third base and thinking you hit a triple. You know, so we gotta realize that we've been born into different realities, you know, and I think for people of faith, this is a moment too. Some of my brothers and sisters have been more white than they are Christian. We got to allow our identity in Jesus to change us, you know, so that we, sorry, I got to interrupt.
That's all right. Let the church say amen. I think there's a hand that we might have missed. Another hand. Right over here, and then right here as well. 2 more.
I think one of the issues is that the main problem is I think white people are beginning to feel as though they are losing ground. And I think that's one of the things that has been holding us back. But I think white people need to realize that black people out there trying to get a job, black people got to pay the gas, the electric bill every month just like you do. We all are in the same struggle. And once we realize that we're all in the same struggle, I think this will make us better people. And I think number 45 have made us come to the light.
I think there's another question right up here. Raise your hand high. We don't want to miss you. A question for our panel.
My question has to do with what can we do about our youngsters? And I'll just give you a little bit of backdrop on that. When Dr. Gassman talked about the Jewish people who constantly say, we'll never forget, you know, and they teach the Holocaust in school, in Hebrew school, and wherever they can. And it seems that once desegregation came about, the civil rights law and all that, when we didn't see those horrendous things on TV and the way we as Black people were treated, someone once told me that when we were allowed to assimilate and go to white schools or shop in white stores, that we abandoned our own. And we were so happy to be able to assimilate. And many of our stores and movie theaters closed. So, and when I heard that people like, I think it's Colin Kaepernick and Kanye West, didn't even vote because they couldn't see a difference between Clinton and Trump, or 45. So my concern is, there are many of us who have passed on what's happened in our own families, but for the most part, as I talk with the younger generation, I don't get the sense that there's that same passion about where we are today. And, I guess what I wonder is, I don't see our churches leading us in that. I don't see our schools leading us in that. And many of our families, because we're struggling so hard to just make ends meet, I don't think we're indoctrinating or teaching our kids about this. So I guess the question is, do you have any suggestions about where do we go from here to teach our youngsters about where we need to be and what our past was like?
Is that question aimed specifically at any particular panelist? All right.
Anyone.
I would just throw in, for the last 30 years, we've been studying a concept called racial socialization, and that's sort of what you're saying, that does it matter if parents talk to their kids about race? Does it affect how they engage in academics? Does it affect emotion, like anger management, depression management? And we've learned a lot that it does. It's a protective factor. The question is why? Why would talking to your children about race actually give them a sense of who they are? The way Mary Beth has talked about talking to her daughter. Well, when you talk to young people, they're confronted by racial elephants all the time. And amazingly, nobody asks them, what's it like? How does difference matter in your life? Has anybody ever treated you different because of your difference? The way you walk, your skin color. And they have amazing stories, and they come out. And when you give them explicit feedback about, here's what I'd like for you to do, when somebody dismisses you, they are then left, they have a sense of confidence that this is an elephant I have seen before. My parents talked to me about it. We role played it. I don't feel so helpless. I have voice, right? And I have my own way of speaking that voice. And so we've learned not only is it a protective factor, just through basic research, but the more explicit you are, the more useful they can take those tools. And we talk about healthy racial comeback lines because adults who are afraid to lose their jobs don't always speak their minds, but young people can't get through a day without defending themselves. If you let a day go by, your social position could change tomorrow if you don't have a comeback that says, I reject your rejection of me. You don't have to curse anybody out, but you have to stand up for yourself psychologically. And I would just say, I'm also an Eastern University graduate, so Eastern's well represented. Just want to throw that in. But there's some socialization that I would argue is absolutely necessary for young people to actually be strong in their voice and not swallow that inferiority.
And I would just add to that. I mean, I think that there is definitely something to your point about, what I learned about Jim Crow, I did not learn from asking my mother or my grandparents about it, right? And so there are a lot of children who become adults, there are a lot of parents who become grandparents who we know lived through segregation. I mean, we're not talking about, nobody's able to interview their family member who lived through American slavery, right? Like, those people are dead. There are many people who are not dead who lived through segregation in America, black and white, by the way, because racism touched everybody in America and it affected the oppressor and the oppressed. And that's very important. So there are white children, there are black children, who have not talked to their family members, neighbors, anybody that they know that is of a certain age, and they're people of a certain age who it is painful. They did not want to necessarily share those stories. My mom didn't want to talk about, what that meant, the indignities of segregation. She didn't want to talk to her children about that. She wanted to protect her children from that, and also, brace them for the realities that they were going to face, but not from her own personal experience, right? So, and that was a thing that a lot of parents and grandparents, have done. Some people think that did our children and their children a disservice. The internet is a beautiful thing. I personally have an insatiable appetite for that history and context, but not everybody does. But for people who do, that is a resource that is available. So much of what is at the new and beautiful National Museum of African American History and Culture is available online. It is free, and it is there for people who want to learn more. And it's free for everybody, black, white, brown, yellow, whatever. If you want to get that, it is there and available for you to get. And that's true for a lot of cultures that we want to and should want to know more about. So if you're not going to get it from your parent, if you're not going to get it in school, and you probably aren't, frankly, going to get it from your school, there are a lot more places to get that than there used to be.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. One more question. One more question.
I'm sorry.
Couple of hands in the back.
I know, right?
Raise your hands one more